Wisaarkhu discussion today. Today we are indeed honored, and we were just talking about this earlier, that we are indeed honored to be having such esteemed guests on these discussions. And today I'd like to introduce you to our guest, Dr. Rhonda Faragher, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, who is an associate professor in inclusive education. She has internationally recognized expertise in the mathematics education of learners with Down syndrome. In her research and teaching, she works to improve the educational outcomes of students who have difficulties learning mathematics. Beyond mathematics education, she has expertise in inclusive education in a range of contexts, including secondary classrooms. Dr. Faragher is the director of the Down Syndrome Research Program within the School of Education. She is an appointed board member to the Academy on Education, Teaching and Research of the International Association for the Scientific Study of Intellectual and Developmental Disability, chair of the Down Syndrome Special Interest Research Group, trustee of Down Syndrome International, and an independent director of Down Syndrome Australia. She is co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Policy and Practice in Intellectual Disabilities. Dr. Faragher is a senior fellow of the Higher Education Academy, a fellow of IASSIDD, the International Association for the Scientific Study of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, and has received a number of awards for her work, including the 2020 UQ Award for Excellence in Community, Diversity and Inclusion, the 2016 ACU Vice Chancellor's Medal for Staff Excellence, a Commonwealth of Australia Endeavour Executive Award, and the 2011 Mathematics Education Research Group of Australasia Research Award. I'm sure your CV goes much longer than that, but I don't want to take up too much time because I'd like you to really have the full time to share your expertise with us. So I'm going to hand over to you, Dr. Rhonda Faragher.
Thanks, Mariam. It's lovely to be here. So let me just share my screen. And I just need to make sure I've got the right one. Remember how we were saying that it's, we don't want to look too polished? Well, it's not looking polished. There we go. I think that's the one. Rightio. So you should see this very soon, I hope. Slideshow from beginning. How's that? Just give me a yell, somebody, if you can see it.
That's good. We can see it, yes.
Lovely. Thank you. So what I was invited to speak about was stigma regarding mathematics and learners with intellectual disability. And this is a topic quite dear to my heart because I was a secondary maths teacher and I did an honours project around graphics calculators, and I was really interested in students who found maths difficult and challenging, but not necessarily for any intellectual disability reasons. And when I moved into that field, there was a sense that it was not quite as well regarded. It was quite a shock, actually. But this is why I do research. There's my little Blossom. She's about to turn 25, so that photo was taken some time ago. But Ruth was born with Down syndrome, and it's been a part of my life's adventure with her to learn. First of all, it was me trying to work out how to teach her maths, and I was worried about it when she was that small in the basket, can you believe? And along the way, I've found things that have probably been helpful to other parents and to teachers as well. I found some really intriguing things. Now, let's have a look at one of these things. This is a worksheet that was sent home to for a boy who was in year 9, so he was about 14 at that stage, and he has Down syndrome. Now, if you have a look at it, we can see it. I hope you can. It's got very simple additions, subtractions, single digits, and set out in a linear fashion. He hated this. absolutely hated it, more than hated it, because he actually found it hard to do. He knew it was babyish. He'd been trying to do it since he was in about year 1 or 2, and it hadn't had a lot of success. So his mum asked if that was what I thought was the thing. Considering he wasn't happy, his mum wasn't happy, and his teacher wasn't happy either, it seemed like it wasn't the thing to do. And what I had learned was this possibility of using the curriculum for the year level, so he's in year 9, and making adjustments. So the curriculum that he was doing, his class was doing, was linear equations. So he's a very clever teacher. With a conversation of about an hour or so, we just chatted around about the idea and then how you might do it. This is what she came up with. So here's the worksheet that was then sent home, and the mum sent me a photocopy of it. It says solve for y equals x plus 7. And we've probably all taught classes to do these sorts of things where we've got different values for x and you have to find the value for y. And the teacher then set out an example. Take -2 as your example for x, substitute it in. Can you believe? Sorry, I didn't quite catch. So Siri's trying to help. So I thought it wasn't listening. That's my phone. I've turned it off. There we have the substitute into the values and solve it and put the value in there. Now, he loved this and he did it so quickly. Back it came, quick as a flash. But you also see what he's doing. Repeated single-digit addition. But now it's in a context that is like his peers. And he went on to do some quite remarkable work, which we'll see shortly. So what I'm going to talk about is, what are the stigmas that exclude students? What are their views of mathematics, of learning maths, and what can we do as teachers? So one of the things I wanted to start with is to think about current approaches for learners who are a long way behind learning milestones. So let me I'm going to stop presenting that one and I'm going to go to a tab. And Randy, in the last presentation I saw, made some wonderful references to this fabulous series of The Simpsons. Well, here's my my offering to you.
Okay, now everyone take out your safety pencil and a circle of paper. This week, I hope we can finish our work on the letter A.
Let me get this straight. We're behind the rest of our class, and we're going to catch up to them by going slower than they are? Cuckoo!
So, somewhere I've lost you. Oh, there we are. Okay. Present now. There we are. That's a very common approach. Now, the teachers aren't cuckoo. We're not cuckoo. We're doing what we've been taught to do. We've been doing what is expected, is what the research has told us, what the textbooks tell us. And so what we see happening, and this is from research, we see that easier work from previous years is often a strategy when learners are a long way behind. Sometimes they're doing completely different content. So students doing linear algebra, they're off doing that, while students who are a long way behind are working on something else. Sometimes they're offered life skills or functional maths. So what's behind those beliefs? There's a belief, and a very strong one, that mathematics is hierarchical and must be learned in order. So there's no point in trying to do multiplication if you can't do addition. There's no point in doing geometry or linear algebra or trigonometry. There's also a utilitarian view that we do mathematics because it's going to be needed in the future. and we put pure mathematics in the curriculum for people who may well go on to university mathematics. But for the rest, well, we put them into other streams. So there's a sense of what's needed for the future. But as we see our 1970s accountant here, it's very hard to predict what the future is going to be, and what he needed to learn in school for the job he did is very different to what students need to learn now for their futures, which we don't know what they are. And then there's also a pervasive view that mathematics is too hard for some students, and it's unkind to inflict it on them. And that, for those of us who love maths, it's a bit of a shock that there are people out there, and we know them, they're the ones who we try not to admit at barbecues and parties that we actually are maths teachers, because you'll get those litany of complaints. But they're the ones that think that, well, why would you do this to kids with intellectual disability? Why would you do this to kids who are struggling? They're going to hate it. But let's see, what are the kids' views? I've been involved in a research study which has been absolutely delightful, working with kids and their teachers with Down syndrome, the students with Down syndrome, regular classrooms, working with their teachers, and we've been looking at what might be possible. And the answer to that question is they love it, absolutely love it. So here are some examples. This young girl, she is now in year 8 in that class. Her teacher was doing tasks from Enrichment, that maths website from the UK. A lot of work there for gifted students, but really it's about challenging all learners. And she was absolutely transfixed. They were there watching a video. This was that balloon example of adding and subtracting positive and negative integers. Absolutely transfixed. There's my daughter, who hated anything to do with homework, except when she got into doing algebra, she loved it, and out came the homework. It was fantastic. It was quite a surprise. This little fella, he was in year 8. He was in a bottom stream class, but it was a regular class, and there were many kids in that class who were not as enthusiastic about mathematics as we would hope. I guess most of you have taught students in that sort of space, as I have. But this lad, he was totally absorbed, absolutely excited and really interested. And this, he was doing, you can see, he was doing power notation. And he was assessed at being at year 3 level. And so this was year 8 work that he was doing alongside his peers. So you won't be able to hear the sound on this, but just watch the reaction of this boy. Can you hear him say, I love it? Can you just see it? Now, this is Bobby from the beginning, who back in year 9 first had that taste of linear algebra. He's now in year 11. He's doing statistics. His teachers taught him how to use a graphics calculator, and you can see he loves it. What a wonderful response. So students love it. What can we do to help them engage with mathematics? It can be a really overwhelming thing, but we can do it. And the strategy that I think is the most effective is year level appropriate curriculum. And there's one of the students in the study, and he was engaging with year 9 work and using his calculator, which he really loved. And he was quite initially pretty quiet sort of fellow, and yet he really engaged with this work. So you start with the content you'll teach to the rest of the class, and then you plan adjustments. So you start with the lesson that you're going to do, but then you think through each stage of the lesson and you think, what are going to be the barriers that the students might have to this learning? Enabling prompts is a term that's used by some Australian researchers. And that's about thinking about, particularly enriched tasks, what support will you need to help students to get into a task? How do you help them to engage? And in this case, let's say with the lesson, what are the points that you think they're going to have difficulties, and what support could you give them? But the important thing is only to offer them when the students show they need them. And we found this in our research study. We had a teacher that was a fill-in teacher, and she'd been told there was a student with Down syndrome, there was an easier worksheet prepared. What she didn't know was that she could give him the standard worksheet and then just see. She gave him the easy one first. And I just said, look, would you mind giving him the other one? And he went right through it. And she said, oh, I just didn't realise I could. And so that was something, it was a really helpful conversation with that teacher, because we then realised, well, that there's that sense that you don't need to give these adjustments unless the student shows they need them. And sometimes they surprise us. Because year level appropriate curriculum, we're finding really astonishing results. And this has led for these teachers to say it's some of the best teaching they've ever done. It's such a surprise to them of what the students can achieve. So year level appropriate curriculum is about jumping over, and we are really seeing that idea of maths as being hierarchical doesn't hold water, that you can allow students to jump over what we thought were preliminary steps. And sometimes they fill those steps as they go. So thinking back to Bobby's work with his single-digit addition, he was doing it now in terms of linear algebra and getting lots of practice. So the big ideas in this short chat is that all learners can learn and enjoy mathematics. That's really something that we're finding, even students who seem to be a long, long way behind. And more than that, they deserve the right to do so. So we need to work out how we can do this. And we can support them to engage with this by using year level curriculum. More than that, it's great fun. So it's the end of, I guess, just a taste of some of the things that have been on my mind for some years now. And I always pay tribute to the people who've taught me the most, and it's the young people with intellectual disability. And I invite you, if you would like, to keep in a conversation with me after this chat, and there's my email address, and I'd welcome an email conversation. Other than that, I will hand back to Mariam.
Thank you so much, Professor Faragher. That was actually quite enlightening. As you were talking, I was thinking about, I'm a clinical psychologist, and when we do developmental psychology, I thought about the stage of a child when they are about 2 years old. It's the stage where they have to learn autonomy. And so, I mean, when we work with parents, we often tell them to allow the child to, because at that age, the child wants to do things for themselves, and you need to allow that process to happen so that they can learn. You are there as a support and as a guide to make sure they don't get hurt, but you have to let that process happen so that they can learn autonomy. And so I just thought about that as you were talking. I just want to at this point, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that's a really good point. And we know in maths that there is that temptation for us to particularly in problem solving lessons, to give the students the answers rather than leave them in that time of productive struggle. And yeah, it's knowing that you actually are doing the right thing in the long run is really important. Actually, that reminds me of another thing. We found with teacher aides, we have teaching assistants who are untrained, sort of like adult helpers in the classrooms when there are students with intellectual disability. And if it's hard for a teacher to hold back from telling, it's really, really difficult for a teacher aide, because they're employed to help and they don't want to look like they're being lazy or not helping. And so it's really important, I think, for teachers to reassure a teacher aide and also to really let them know that's what the aim is that autonomy that you're talking about.
I like the term that you've used, productive struggle. I think that's
no, it's not mine.
But that's a good term to use.
It's a good one, isn't it?
It is a good one. It is a good one. So before we continue, I just would like to invite, if there are any of the participants who would like to ask any questions, please leave your name in the chat function so that I can just keep track of who would like to ask a question. And again, there's a question that I had, and allow me to start with the questions. You spoke about the plan adjustments in the classroom, and I wondered again, when again in psychology we're exposed to intellectual disability, and for me I almost understand it as on a continuum, that you get mild, moderate to severe. And I wondered, when you have to make adjustments, plan adjustments, is there something that has to be kept in mind? Would there be different adjustments depending on the level of intellectual disability?
That's a good question. There are different adjustments, but these are based, and they would be based on those levels, but it's more about the teachers get to know their students really well. And that's one of the delightful things when you're working with teachers and you get to see their expertise. Because they've got to know their students really well, they can already predict when they're planning their lesson where the challenges are going to be and what are the blocks going to be. And so it's probably even more refined than those categories. And I think a lot of us, when we were first taught to teach, we were told to teach to the middle, and then we were taught, oh, then there are some gifted kids, and then there are some kids with difficulties. And so there were sort of three groups, but these teachers were much more subtle than that. They were much more attuned to looking at and knowing that student really well. And some things they'd know, nope, they're going to have no trouble with this at all. And so, yeah, it's really, it's very, very skillful teaching. But these weren't specially trained teachers. These were regular general classroom teachers who were just very good at working with students. And so I think that's another important point, that there are no special techniques that you go away to college to learn something new. These teachers had these skills already in their repertoire, and they were just refining them when they were working with students with Down syndrome for the first time.
Okay, thank you for that. I see we've got some questions. So we first have Sumaya. Sumaya, you can go ahead.
Hi. I was just wondering, in terms of the peers in the classroom, and like, I know that some students with learning difficulties do go to special schools, but there are some that go to mainstream schools. And your peers do affect you in the classroom, and especially in terms of helping someone with a learning difficulty. And I think my question is just like, how can other students help? Yeah.
That's a wonderful question. I think sometimes teachers think they've got to do it all, or they've got to have a teacher aide. And you're absolutely right that peers will teach so much more. And that's one of the advantages of being in an inclusive classroom, because these kids are surrounded by students who have the ability to teach them, if not directly, but by the student copying, watching what they're doing, the modelling of the behaviours. And we found in our study, our students particularly wanted to do work that was like their peers. And once they are doing work like their peers, they can get help. They can also help other ones. And some of the teachers that when they, like the teacher who taught the student to use a graphics calculator, she very explicitly wrote out the steps for him, but then she for any adjustments that she made 2 copies. She laminated the copies. She put one on the front desk so that any student in the class could come up and use it, and she gave one to the student with Down syndrome. And it was really interesting to watch how the other kids were using these resources. And so what helps one student helps the others, and then these kids can talk to each other and help one another. But more explicitly, what you were talking about of peers helping, I watched that the second student there with his red calculator, he had a friend without any disability who just enjoyed his company, and they were just great mates, and they supported them a lot. And then one lesson, this young fella, he taught the other student, he taught him about right angle triangles, and that was really a powerful moment. He'd finished and they were doing revision, and so he took it on himself to teach him about right angle triangles because they were going on to do Pythagoras' theorem. So yeah, thanks for that. That's a really important point.
Thank you, Ms. Meyer, for that question, and thank you, Dr. for the answer. Next we have Karen Brand.
Hi, thank you. I also work as a psychologist, and I do a lot of assessments with learners for concessions in classroom and for school placements and things like that. So for me, this has been so enlightening because the whole remedial approach that is taken is to go to the student's level and build up from there. So what you're saying today is with that, we're actually keeping them, you know, at a certain level, not allowing them to explore and look at new things. And I love that. I love what it does for their self-esteem, and that there might be other things, yeah, that's making sense, which is fantastic. I find with sometimes with kids that really has difficulty just with their working memory, and it's not necessarily a maths problem. The calculator is very useful as a concession for them in tests and exams. It makes a huge difference, and then they can do same level maths because many of them can't do that if they don't have that access to a calculator. So that's a very useful tool. And then I was just wondering if there's certain if there is any core skills, because I always have this idea, I'm not a mathematician at all, past the statistics that I did in my course, but I always have the idea, you know, if a student understood like the 1 to 10 and how they grasp that concept, that they can build from there and do anything else. But, you know, I was just wondering if there's certain core skills that you think helps for them to have to be able to go further, or is it really just sort of giving them and trying and see what their brain can do with certain areas?
Yeah, look, I'd love to chat with you for hours, Karen. That's a really important question that we're grappling with. We don't have at this stage any sense that that's the case. Certainly, the more you know, the easier it is. So certainly if you know the numbers 1 to 10 and know the order that they come in, that's going to be much more helpful than if you don't. If you know more numbers and you know where they fit on a number line, that's going to be even more helpful. One of the interesting and quite intriguing things that we think we've found is that learners with Down syndrome also have dyscalculia. And this is a very specific, as you would be aware, I'm sure, possibly of brain origin, a deficit in the way the brain functions and thinks about number. We find this because people with Down syndrome exhibit the same sort of characteristics that's in the general literature around dyscalculia. And there aren't any studies of MRI brain imaging of people with Down syndrome yet. One day I hope there will be. But at this stage, we think that's the case because people like, and partly where this hypothesis came from was watching my own daughter, that she can do quite sophisticated mathematics. It's astonishing the sorts of mathematics her teachers taught her. She could factorize quadratics, she could find solutions to curves, she could do remarkable things. And yet to this day, like she said to me in the shops today, she got meat, $8 for one packet of meat, $8 for another packet of meat. And so she said, so that's $9. I was like, oh, no, it isn't, darling. No. And you sort of think, all right. So we can't with any certainty say you must have certain things. However, of course, the more you know, like the more tables you know, that's better. But if you haven't got those things, a calculator is that very important prosthesis. And, you know, it's helping the body do what it can't do so they can go on to do other things. And so we don't actually know how many kids in our classrooms have dyscalculia, but I guess I didn't even know about it. And it's only been talked about and put into the literature in recent years, but it is something that we should never give up on trying to help people get a sense of number, but we shouldn't keep flogging it.
I just want to quickly add one more thing. So something that I think we've always seen as a negative is that many of the students, they get concessions and they're doing their own maths programs with those ones that's within the mainstream schools, that's not in special schools. But then at the end of the year, they have to do the curriculum paper and basically fail it to prove that they need to stay on their own, curriculum. And it's always been quite a negative thing. Why are we putting the kids through this? It's hard for them. They know they can't do it. But I actually now, after what you're saying, think that the teachers can use that sheet to go through to see what did they get right and what can they do, and maybe build on that and see what of the age appropriate skills is. So I'm going to definitely take a different take in terms of making recommendations for that, to say, go and look at the one that they had to write that they failed, but find those golden nuggets that they could do and build on that in terms of their skills. That's very helpful. Thank you so much.
And also when they're doing those tests, they should have the adjustments that they've had in learning. So that could be something to think about too.
Thank you.
Wonderful. I'd love to hear how that works out. You let me know.
Thanks so much, Karen, for your input and for those questions. And I think, like you said, Prof, that we could probably speak for hours, and hopefully we get the opportunity to speak to you again. But we have some more questions. Next up, we have Tristan Barnard. You can go ahead.
Hello, Dr. Faragher. I hope you can hear me.
Indeed, Tristan.
So yes, thank you very much for being here with us, and I think it's quite a privilege to be able to talk to you. But what I'm quite interested in is, I've seen, as we know, science is quite grounded in mathematics, and I recall from my grade 11 or matric science class how that the teacher would arrange us from best mark to worst mark in seating order to show us what we would be up against when we go to Plasticity. And I saw one student who would always find themselves at the bottom of the seating arrangement, and eventually they no longer took science. And I'm quite curious to hear your opinion on that, regarding what sort of emotional state do you think these people generally find themselves in when they feel as though they no longer can do mathematics or science, for instance, and how do you prevent that? How do you keep them motivated to keep trying?
Yeah, you know, I had exactly the same thing when I was in year 11 and 12. We were seated like that, and I was the one who was near the front, because all the, you know, the top marks were at the back row, and it sort of cycled all the way around, you know, and there has to be someone at the bottom. You know, you still might be doing all right, but as soon as you are there, it's a very obvious indication that you're not as good as the other people. And this has been a very well studied area of mathematics psychology, and the self-fulfilling prophecy pours into this, and your beliefs about yourself as a learner and the beliefs that others hold about you as a learner are very powerful. And we think about in medicine that placebo effect is so strong that to test any drug, they have to blind it, not only from the person receiving it, but the person giving it. And if you think that can affect the body in terms of whatever the drug is doing, that's a physical thing. How much more is it going to be when we're dealing with emotions and psychology, and that's absolutely what's been found. And so you're absolutely on the money. So what do? Well, we certainly don't see kids in that way. And we also need, I suppose, to constantly be thinking about not comparing people, because we really want to be aiming towards achievement of learning outcomes. So for an individual, what's the next step? What are you going to be moving on to next? And what's the good in what you're already doing? So the other thing I think is helpful is to use the placebo effect in reverse. So you hold a belief about all learners that they can learn, and that's a really powerful thing. But then you also tell them, and you can mess with their minds. It's fabulous working with kids, because you can say things like, "You're the best class I've ever taught," and you're just amazing. And it is one of those things that you can see it really happening over the time that you have them. So, yeah.
If I may, how far can you push that though? If somebody is so firmly set in their belief that they cannot do mathematics, how far can you push them down the road to coming back to it?
Yeah. There's a really lovely book called The Myth of Ability, and by John Mighton. And he began with teaching kids who'd been kids in prisons and all sorts of places, and really had very poor opinions of themselves as learners. And some of them told him, they'd got Fs on their papers since they were in preschool. And he started with fractions, and he very carefully structured how he taught them fractions, breaking it down, very small steps, so they couldn't possibly fail. And they were achieving these things. And the reason he said he started with fractions is because they all expected they wouldn't be able to do it. And algebra is another one, that people just expect they're not going to be able to do it. And then when they actually can, their delight in their own achievement is what takes them further. And so who knows where the boundaries lie? Really, we just don't know unless we try. And I guess it's that personal relationship with students, knowing them well and really believing in them and never giving up.
That's absolutely fantastic. And to be in all honesty, I would love to see more people doing mainstream mathematics and stuff and believing in themselves. So thank you for answering my questions. And I'll leave it to the floor to the next couple of questions.
Thanks, Tristan.
Thanks, Tristan, for that question. Prof, yesterday or the day before, Sean and I were talking about this very thing, and I was telling him about the modality that I use in psychology, which is called cognitive behavioral therapy. And it's based on the premise that our thoughts and our meanings that we create, it influences how we respond to situations. So when we're sitting with math, and if there's a difficulty with completing the task, it's not necessarily the task that is difficult that is creating that negative perception towards, but the meaning that I make in that moment that I can't do this, that I'm not good at this, that I'm not good enough to complete this task. And so that's in CBT, that's where we address those thoughts that we create, those meanings that we have. But this discussion is just getting more and more interesting, and I really hope that we can do some kind of a follow-up. Sean and Sophie, I hope you guys are listening. We have another question from Anna Muller. Anna, would you like to ask your question yourself, or would you like me to read it?
Okay, can you hear me?
Very faintly. Okay, in the meantime, I'll read the question. Anna has asked,
do you have a method of teaching children with dyscalculia? I have a grandchild with that, and she is 16 years old and has no number sense. Must the kids in your country with dyscalculia take math in higher levels?
Great question, Anna. We don't have a technique, and I don't think we know enough about it. There are some researchers working on the idea of brain plasticity, where they use computer trials over and over and over, 10,000, choosing which are more dots and so on, is it 2 dots or 4 dots, which is more, all those sorts of things over and over and over, aiming to train the neural pathways. As far as I know, they haven't had success yet. Personally, I think that's cruel and unusual punishment. I can't think of anything more boring. And so if it is a brain difference, then what we need to be thinking about is, okay, the part of the brain that would normally process quantity and an understanding of quantity is not working. What these people are doing are using other neural circuits, and that's how they actually diagnose this in typical population. They compare how long they take to do these sorts of calculations to see, are they doing it instantly or are they using these slower neural circuits? You can imagine, because people with Down syndrome and other intellectual disabilities typically take longer to do things, that wouldn't work, so we need another way. But for people in the general population who have dyscalculia, it is one of the things, because they're using other neural circuits, then what we want to do, I would think, is provide as many opportunities as we can to use those other circuits. One of the things that we need to have is a mental number line, so a sense of where the numbers are in relation to each other, and that's typically missing in people with dyscalculia. So having a number line visible all the time can be very powerful. So it could be in a classroom, up on the wall. For a student, it can be on their books. But the other thing is, for somebody who has dyscalculia, a calculator is the device that will help them work around it. And in my country, yes, to finish year 12, you do need to do mathematics. They can do any sort of mathematics, and so often for kids who are behind, they will do very simple calculation. And kids with dyscalculia, that's the exact stuff they can't do. So what we would suggest here is give them a calculator, stop asking them to do simple calculations that they can't do, but with support, do other mathematics, and that they're good at. And I must admit that I use my calculator more often than I should, perhaps, and certainly now I'm not in a classroom doing mental computation all the time. I'm really slowing down, and I do find a calculator everywhere. There on my phone, I can look around my room here at the moment. I've got calculators everywhere, and it's not because I need them for support. They're just available. They're on my computer. They're just around. So it is a very, very accessible accommodation, and it's really something that, I liken it to people who need glasses. We don't tell people, you got to show me you can read without them before you're allowed to wear your glasses. And that's the equivalent. If you can't do calculation and you make people do it by hand or mentally before you let them use a calculator, it's just not going to work. And so it's an adjustment they need. So I hope that's helpful, Anna.
Rhonda, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, now in our schools, in the secondary schools, maths is compulsory up to grade 12. So they take it, the core maths, up to grade 9. And then they must choose between maths literacy and core maths. But then this grandchild of mine, she got a concession. My daughter adopted her. It's a black child, and she has the alcohol syndrome, or what do you call it?
Yeah, fetal alcohol syndrome.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and then they get the concession, but they must take it up to grade 9. And then they can choose any other subject. They needn't take the maths lit. But it's difficult then to get a school where they can choose 4 subjects that need no numbers. I mean, she can't take accounting, she can't take economy, she can't take science. So there's so few subjects. But I was thinking, when you told me your daughter said $8 and $8 is $9, I once took her to the nursery to buy a potting soil, and I gave her a 100 Rand note and 2 10 Rand notes, and I think she was about 14. And I asked her, because I was too dirty to get out, she must go and buy it, and how many change must you get? And so I said, Deneo, she's going to take the 100 Rand and the 110 Rand, and from the other 10 Rand, the woman must take 9 Rand. How many change must you get? And she didn't know. And I said, what comes before 10? And she said 11.
Yeah, now that's another typical expression of dyscalculia, that it's like the alphabet. So if you think what's before L, most people have to go forward to think what comes before L. So that's a very difficult thing. We're fortunate in our country, just about everything now is pay on a card, tap and go, so we don't have to do that sort of thing. But I think a lot of those subjects, like science, can be done by a student with dyscalculia. My daughter did biology in year 11 and 12, so with support it can be done. But maybe if you want to email me, we could perhaps keep a conversation going. I might be able to suggest some adjustments.
I'll do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Rhonda, I was just thinking, as you were talking, in your very first slide, you mentioned that those beliefs about mathematics, and that one of the things you said was that there's a belief that it is hierarchical, that you have to learn it in a hierarchical manner, that one part of the information builds onto another. And I wonder if that is because you're saying now that one doesn't have to have certain skills if there are other affordances that you can make use of, or other resources that you can make use of to calculate, for example, like the calculator. But if I think back to when I was at school, that we had to get to a certain stage before we were almost allowed to use a calculator, that you needed to be able to first do it on your own. And you say now that this is, we need to shift this way of thinking about math and how we learn it, or how we teach it to children.
Well, that's where this is challenging and new, because we don't know whether most people learn mathematics in the order that it's in the curriculum. So we don't know whether the curriculum has emerged because that's the way humans learn it, or humans learn it because that's the way the curriculum presents it. So we really don't know that. There's work that is, there's a lot of work going on in the States and some parts of Australia around trajectories of learning. And so there would be a suggestion that there are stages that many, maybe most students go through. But what I think I'd like to say is not that we want to stop doing that, because it works for a great deal of children. I think it's when we get learners who are getting behind and become further and further behind, insisting that they stick with that trajectory just traps them in a cycle of being retaught and taught, retaught, and never getting out of that particular area. And this approach of using the year level curriculum, making adjustments, allows students to keep moving. And we've seen the results of that, in that learners are engaging with really quite sophisticated mathematics while they have clear gaps. So I'm not really advocating that we do this for everybody, but I am suggesting that it is something to consider when we've got learners who are behind for whatever reason, you know, poverty, illness, whatever reason, just keeping them moving.
Okay, so almost just including some flexibility in that system. I see we have two last questions. We have one from Anita and then Sean. You can go ahead, Anita.
Thank you. I was just thinking, I teach at university, and basically if a student doesn't meet the requirements, they repeat the course. And although, you know, our university students generally, they're not, they don't come with big intellectual disabilities, usually because the system is against them to get into that level. But there certainly is diversity in the class. And this, you know, for students who have to repeat a course, it's quite demoralizing. Really what should be happening, I think, is that the pacing should match where they're at. To a certain extent. So it's complex because there's lots of issues that can impact whether a student is going to meet the grade or not. But I was wondering, in general, do you think that it's better for a student to be moving on, even though they don't fully have gaps? I mean, we do this because a student passes with 50% grade. And the next course, it's assumed that you have 100% knowledge of the previous course, and it's taught that way. So we actually are doing that in a way, but there's almost a sense of dishonesty about it, because it depends on who the teacher is and if they're really trying to meet the students individually, which I can do in my smaller classes much more easily than someone who's got 600 people in a class.
Yeah, that's true.
So I don't know, in Australia, do students move year by year, or do they have to repeat a year? And is that, you know, from school? Do they repeat years?
Rarely in school. So that it used to be the case, but rarely in school. So they would keep going. But if they don't pass, say, year 9 or year 10, higher level maths, they won't be allowed to keep going into that area. And I guess by the time students get to university, they've self-selected. So they have selected a course that they're eligible to enroll in, perhaps, and hopefully it's one they're interested in as well. And so people tend to have their areas of interest. But we like you, we do, once you're at 50%, they can move on. I liken it to, you know, if they fail, they just need another run through to, you know, to bed down. And as you say, there can be lots of factors that can mean that they haven't got through the first time. And for my students, many of them, they found the bar before they decided that it was time to study, and the second time round it's a bit more serious. Not all of them, of course. But yes, and that was such a good point that you made, that we do assume that they've got all that material under their belt when they move into the next part. So it's a very interesting point you make. But I guess the difference at university level is that it is an exit, and it's also a qualification. And for many of the courses they're doing, they're professional recognition, and so they have to be able to do what it is that they're receiving an award to do. So in terms of adjustments, we in Australia have legislation, so at universities we are allowed to provide, and we're legally required to provide, learning support adjustments, but not to the point that they alter the fundamental or inherent requirements of the program. So I've had a student recently who has considerable anxiety and didn't want to do presentations in front of her class, but we've set that as an inherent requirement because they'll be out on prac and having to teach students, so they need these interim steps to help them prepare for that. So that's an adjustment that we would not accept, and we would have the legal right not to accept that. But she also was aware that when that was explained to her that this was a stepping stone and it was helping her to get ready for it. So it's very interesting points you make. Thanks. I'd love to have coffee with you too. I'd love to have coffee with you all.
Well, you're welcome. Come join us in Cape Town one day.
I love Cape Town.
I was just about to invite Rhonda as well. I think we definitely need to have a follow-up. Sean has a question, and then there's 2 questions in the chat that I'll read out. Sean, you may go ahead.
Okay, thank you. The slide that got me most was where you were challenging those 3 assumptions. Maths is hierarchical. We teach what is needed in maths, and sometimes maths is just too hard for some of us. And it's liberating to hear that maths doesn't have to be hierarchical. Secretly, as a maths teacher, high school maths teacher, I'm almost a bit shy to admit that sometimes it doesn't have to be that way. And for example, once a week, I've been asked to come and help out with the grade 7s, the senior grade, the oldest students of the prep school, which is just next door to where I teach. And we've just been doing, it's called Maths Enrichment, where we've been doing things like last week, this last week, we've been talking about factorials, which we normally introduce in grade 12, the senior year. Yeah. And you know, we talk about things like how many ways can you rearrange people in a queue, and just to make it far more interesting, you can do any type of maths and just dig around and play around with it. Just like, I guess I could try and find neuroscience and the stuff that automatically I find out of my reach, but I can still dig in there, play around, and find it entertaining. And I think if we can go into teaching of maths and learning of maths that way, it just liberates us.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, I love that thought.
Yeah. So it's not a question, it's just a bit of feedback, and it's very exciting to hear new ideas or even old ideas that sound new. It's
yeah,
liberating.
that's right. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Sean. There's 2 last questions. So the first one, to Dr. Faragher, would you say that there is a case to be made that we are too hard on ourselves as well as others? As I believe there's a case to be made that when we all are not thinking, it is very easy to make mistakes. Take, for instance, pilots landing with the gear up by simply doing tasks out of order.
Yeah, look, I own up to that one. I think we are hard on ourselves, and it is easy to make mistakes, absolutely. And I think for kids, there's a pressure on them because every time they answer a question in a class, we are naturally making judgments about whether they've got it or not. And I don't believe errors are random. I think errors have come through a thought process. But yeah, sometimes things get in the way. That's a good point.
Thanks. So we have one last question and we have 2 minutes left. So let's just go there quickly. Hi, Rhonda, does using a calculator make learning mathematics simple? And which level must students start using a calculator? In primary school, we were not allowed to use a calculator, and that allowed us to challenge ourselves and learn doing calculations on our own. And it was fun exercises. But we got to secondary school and started using calculators. Then we got used to using the calculator and the calculator doing the work for us. In university, we weren't allowed to use a calculator, but it is helpful as we challenge ourselves. So the question is around using the calculator as a resource.
Yeah, there's been some important research studies on the effects of using calculators. There's a big meta-analysis study of all the research, and their conclusion was that calculators, if used appropriately, didn't diminish the mathematics of the students. So the advice there is all learners at all times, but for appropriate use. So it's not the case. Certainly we need to make sure students can calculate by written method, they can calculate mentally, and they can use a calculator. And then they can choose what's the most appropriate for the time. So while I say I've got calculators all around me, it takes so much more time to actually turn the darn thing on, enter the numbers. And if it's something like 2 times 10, I can do that so much in my head, and that's where we want to get with a lot of calculation. And so we get that way if we've had practice. And one of the important strategies, I think, is to say, before you do any calculation, think before you calculate, what's the answer likely to be? And so often that's enough. You just need to know, you can either get it exactly, if it's something that after you've thought about it, you've got it, or you've got an approximation. Because once you've got that, then even if you use a calculator, you've got a sense of, is the calculator, did I put the right buttons in? Why is that the answer that I didn't expect, and so on. So the evidence is pretty clear. There's quite a lot of it. And if you're interested in it, just shoot me an email and I can send that to you. But it certainly, we don't want kids using them just for becoming too reliant on them. But the way we stop them becoming reliant on them is that think before you calculate. And they go, oh, a minute over.
I think that's fine. It was worth it. A minute was worth it. Thank you so much, Prof. Rhonda Faragher, for giving your time to us. It was such an interesting and enlightening presentation and discussion, and I think that we all agree that we definitely need some kind of follow-up, because there's so much more that we can discuss on this topic. But what you've shared with us thus far was really, really useful for all of us that attended today. So thank you again for your time.
It was absolutely lovely. It was a delight to be here, and I felt like I was there with you.
Maybe one day we'll see you in Cape Town.
I hope so. And maybe one day you come to Brisbane.
Thanks so much for that. Thank you everyone for joining. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye now.